Hi, how's it going? This is Resident of Collinwood for YouTube. I'm here to continue my reading along for the Dark Shadows Daybook UnBound. Chapter 6, 1840, Masters of Both Worlds. Night has fallen over the great house of Collinwood. 1840 is one of the most obscure storylines of Dark Shadows because it was sort of the end of the series as we know it for the main characters. For several years in the 1980s, I worked for a PBS affiliate that was showing Dark Shadows. And rumor mill around the station stated that the show became increasingly expensive to broadcast via syndication as it went on. I guess the thinking was that viewers would get hooked and then they would have no choice but to pay a King Johnny ransom to satisfy them. Well, as far as we knew, no one was satisfied. I did not see these episodes until the mid 90s on VHS. It is a strange and rambunctious and sometimes floating storyline. And I think one of the things that distances it to this day is that none of its repercussions can be enjoyed in the future episodes. Everything else gets its chance to influence later events, but not this. It also upsets the expected romantic fate of Barnabas by having him reveal that he's in love with Angelique. Okay. I understand why some of you see this as a non sequitur. Yes, the writers were making this up as they went along. However, once a text is finished, you have to look at it as one complete story. At that point, the methods of its construction and trivial. It could very well be that Shakespeare wrote Hamlet while standing on his head. Who cares? If you go back and watch the series with the secret of Barnabas's love in mind, that knowledge and your imagination will have you finding clues and evidence consistently. It becomes a more challenging story. It becomes a far more interesting story. And it becomes a story that doesn't just stop. It has a legitimate and beautiful, painful ending. Episode 1111, Julia responds to the need to pass for normal in 1840 by unleashing a blood-crazed monster she claims is her brother, Daniel Lewis Edmonds. In 1840, Julia hatches a plan with Ben to pass as a Collins. She meets Daniel, the insane patriarch, and Gabriel, his disabled son. Gabriel may have evidence to her real identity via a stolen earring, or he may choose to wear it to complement his girlish bouffant. Julia goes to the mausoleum to unleash Barnabas, displaying the sound evidence-based thinking that preceded her in the field of medicine. 1111 is a breathlessly dense episode introducing or reintroducing audiences to scads of characters. Welcome to 1840 proper. It's a Dickinson time, and the constant coincidence of so many important characters being in a single Dark Shadows episode at once is, well, one worthy of Dickens. The writers have gotten almost too good at this by now. 1795 and 1897 felt as if they rashly meted out new cast of characters, very few at a time. In this case, we meet or hear of 9 or 10. It's almost dizzying, but above all else, it's brave. This is not an incipient universe, but one fully formed. They drop us off in the middle of it, send us a care package, and wish us the best. It's easy to admire the guts behind this. What's not as easy is caring as much as we should. When you meet the characters just a few at a time, you have the luxury of building sympathies with each before the next round comes in. Well, by the time Flora and Gerard enter, I'm exhausted. On the surface, it's easy to conclude that the cast so far isn't particularly likable. Ben looks more grotesquely malignant than aged. It would be easy to appreciate Daniel more if he didn't introduce himself by confessing that he murdered his wife. The character of Gabriel is designed to be one of the villains of the series, and Christopher Pennock has yet to be given the opportunity to enhance him into a delightful one. Not only is Flora a gullible dingbat, she is executed with a voice that really drives the point home. No, Joan Bennett does a hell of a Tiny Tim impression. We meet Gerard. That's true. Pretty much, and hear him speak for the first time. But we already know where his character will wind up. So confirmation bias goes crazy as we look for him to slip up. There's an interesting storytelling lesson here. When Barnabas goes back to deal with Quentin, we already know that the solution to the problem resides in resolving the mystery of who Quentin was and how/why he died. While Gerard certainly isn't responsible for what happened in 1970, he still feels somewhat secondary to all of this. Of course, the sympathetic character in the midst of this is Julia. She hasn't always been the easiest character to like, and her pluckiness here and strange optimism about releasing Barnabas lift her standing even more than seeing her battle zombies. Her first act in this episode is getting into a rumble with a walking, talking story theme. The aged and mentally perfect patriarch Daniel introduces himself by mistaking her for the wife he murdered and tries to murder her all over again. As he does so, he begs to know how many times he will be confronted by this. What a reflective statement by the franchise. Everything here has to do with sins of the past. Everything here deals with people sacrificed for reasons pertaining to love and the convenience of love. How many times does the show take us back with the optimism that if we can just go back far enough to the right enough place, we can prevent even the need to make amends? In his madness, there is wisdom, and it could very well be that Daniel, the show's once and future child and patriarch, is the ideal character to represent all of it. Played by both David Hennessy and Lewis Edmonds, Daniel is at times innocence, corruption, father and son. He is both ends of the spectrum that we know too well, and he unites generations of both actors and characters under similar and desperate roofs. Of course, we will learn that Gabriel is desperate for his approval, even to the point of faking his own disability, and even to the point of murdering him to succeed him. Daniel is the ultimate Collins. In the fusion of generations and actors, he has no female equivalent. In a show with such a female-heavy audience and female-heavy ensemble, which begins with a female protagonist, the fact that the ultimate Collins is male is another quiet way that the show spreads focus and opportunities between the genders. It is appropriate that Julia, vaguely and androgynous herself, or sorry, androgynous herself is our surrogate here. It's high time that Barnabas, her other half, who also has a blend of the complementary gender in his persona arrives. They have a storyline to save. This episode hit the airwaves September 28th, 1970. Episode 1113. Barnabas Collins decides that the only man who can help him avert the apocalypse is the last man he can trust himself. Barnabas, Jonathan Fred. Gerard thinks he has Julia by the short hairs when he dangles a newly fangled earring in front of her as evidence that she comes from another time. Her explanation is credible enough to send Gerard away, leaving her time to conspire with Ben Stokes about recruiting Barnabas for the campaign. Ben finds Barnabas in the old house saying goodbye to Josette's portrait and dominance over his future. As he reasons with the vampire, the present day version of Barnabas consults with Ben's descendant. Surrounded by an insane Carolyn and a suicidal Quentin, Barnabas is compelled to use the I Ching once to take the battle to 1840. He immediately encounters the vision of Julia's grave. Dark Shadows is turning to its most forbidden topic, endings. The job of a soap is to perpetuate misery. It resolves one source only after it slides in another. But this phase of the show is replete with endings, conclusions, and assorted apotheoses. We've seen Collinwood destroyed, and that's how the ending begins. How do you top that? That kind of question surges within 1113 with urgent power. It begins with fatalism and then asks, is that all you got? This is the perverse optimism that you find only at funerals. Because when the universe falls apart, the only certainty is change. When Barnabas, we even see double, the show continues its audacious presentation of parallel storylines. Two different centuries with overlapping casts and one character appearing in both. The most unique acting challenge for Jonathan Frid is playing two different versions of Barnabas, both of whom have their counterparts in the relative future. And Dark Shadows is the only show where the future is 130 years in both directions. This storyline is a bad rap for being confusing. I suppose if you struggle to do things like drop pennies and straighten unknotted rope, you'll find this baffling. But if you can manage those arduous tasks, 1840 is a pleasure. Barnabas Collins may be the long-suffering and occasionally non-breathing heart of Dark Shadows, but Julia Hoffman is its soul. Drop me a line if you can explain the difference, but it sounds good. Following her into 1840, it's clear how far she has come. She began as a conniving, intellectual, ruthless, arrogant invader. If Collinwood tortures its beloved sons and daughters, you can imagine when an outsider puts it in a bad mood. Julia pays her dues. Now she is on the other end of that process. Her scene at the beginning of the episode is a well-earned tribute to smugness. She deflects Gerard's smarmy interrogation with a cool efficiency that borders on descendant relish. Julia knows that she could die at any point. She knows that she is far over her abundant, Kofi head. Not only is she fearless, but she has learned to take pleasure in hosting her enemies with extra petard. Supernatural bullies specialize in lording forbidden knowledge over the rest of us. As Julia frustrates their efforts, her sense of take that is not only admirable, it's infectious. Had Victoria Winters remained on the show, this is the main character we might have gotten, although I doubt it. Julie's age, gumption, and gall are impossible to imagine with anyone else. We're seeing Dan Curtis's dream after all, just by way of the real world. Meanwhile, Barnabas finally takes down the painting of Josette. After all, she let go of him, and she has given him the permission to move on. That's on her end. This is a matter of his own choice. It involves the sort of courage that people can only show when they are too close a tragedy. This is a grace period in the time immediately following a tragedy before its burdens become a part of us. Oddly, decommissioning Josette is a job that could only be accomplished by the 1840 version of Barnabas and the 1970 version of Barnabas. Anything in between had had just enough time to become obsessed with his loss, but not enough experience to contemplate life without it. Barnabas is speaking for himself and the writers when he boasts, "The word safe has no meaning for me." It's an extraordinary point of freedom. Everything is possible because nothing is possible. It's the same kind of desperate bravery shown by the producers as they introduce a backward echo of Pansy Faye, with the nobler ancestor, Letitia Faye. It's a character whose existence has no particular practical sense, but has such a poetic ring of truth that pedantic cavils are undone before they can be spoken. Letitia is there because it's the most interesting continuing character that Nancy Barrett crafted, and because Nancy Barrett intrinsically belongs at Collinwood as its neurotic and self-punishing ray of light, and who has the time to wallow in trivia when they have 50-year-old soap opera to write about? One of the story's primary themes is the decay of our aspirations over time. The introduction of Letitia manages to accomplish this backward. Somehow Letitia is an ancestor of Pansy, and somehow it may just be the cymatic impact of a more natural hair color. Letitia feels a little more human and relatable. And she's not the only double in the episode. Letitia is confident in her use of the supernatural. But Nancy Barrett also plays a vaguely psychic Carolyn in 1113. Her encounter with the paranormal has driven her quite mad, pitting the two characters against each other. Similarly, we have a scene in 1840 where Ben Stokes reasons with his former master to show courage and trust. This transitions to a scene over a century later in the same house where Elliot Stokes shows a newly drawn sense of hesitation and Barnabas must rally him into action. Moments before the 1970, Barnabas is introduced under a looming portrait of himself from Hugger and Happier Days. He is attached to his chair, handling himself to the point that a skull may appear in his palm at any moment. Barnabas is either on the verge of implosion or explosion. He seethers with Stokes, report on the funerals of Carrie, Daphne, Elizabeth, and the assassinated future of the Collins family, David. These are unthinkable, bold, and permanent strokes of storytelling, and they engage Barnabas as they engage us. He has spent his second and third lives doubting his place in the future, and it has suddenly passed him by. It is in this moment that Barnabas truly appreciates the ability that makes him unique. He alone can use the curse of immortality to travel within his own lifespan. And either direction for the trip to 1897, this discovery was an accident. Now its invocation is a mandate. Barnabas rallies to a rare moment of decisive and ferocious action, at the thought he could only be haunted by the past for so long. Within the space of just a few lines, this gentleman of the past again becomes the last best hope for the future. A year ago, this might have been executed with a sense of insouciance Ellen worthy of Alexander Dumas. Fred avoids letting any twinkle spark his eye. Too many people have died, too many regrets filled the ledger. Yes, he is answering the call to adventure, but it is with gravitas and respect. And yet again, the series reinvents itself. Too often he is written off as a villain, literally defamed after his first few months. I will admit he spends a frustrating amount of time doubting his next move. But even when Barnabas is at his most mournfully indecisive, he is to me the great man. It's in scenes like these today that we see why, in fact, those other moments of ethical denial and over intellectual parallels are what make episodes like 1113 such a joy. And the universe surrounding him seems to be in agreement. Even Elliot argues with him about the risk of such a journey. Carolyn glides downstairs for a late afternoon cocktail, and yet another nervous breakdown as Quentin tries to hang himself upstairs. As if to prove Barnabas's point, once Barnabas tries to a tentative trance, the first thing he sees is Julia Hoffman's tombstone from 1840. A call to adventure, indeed. And you wanted to talk about risk? Professor Stokes, let's talk about risk. Risk may be James T. Kirk's business, but for Barnabas, it is his very life. And I can say the same for Dan Curtis. This episode was broadcast September 30th, 1970. Episode 1118. Will Gerard's plans for domination over Collinwood change when he meets his lone sleeping guardian? Barnabas, Jonathan Fripp. Barnabas establishes a relationship with Daniel as he challenges the story of Quentin's drowning. Meanwhile, Judah Zachary attacks Ben Stokes. It's like the past 2 years or so never happened. It's and that's a surprisingly good thing. It's good because for all of the expanded mythos and wonder brought by Nicholas, Quentin, and Count Potofe, we've spent the past couple of years expanding the mythos without always connecting it. It's though tough to realize until you see Daniel Collins and Ben Stokes reminiscing about the doomed nature of the family as a primal focus of nature. Mr. Beale, even though Daniel is a different actor and he really isn't in a cosmic sense, and Ben's face is an unrecognizable topography of the malignant. We know we're home beyond Liz and Roger, seething over brandy and things unsaid. This is home. And when we hear them, these heralds and descendants of elder gods like Joshua and Naomi speak of the Bedford murders. We take it seriously. It's akin to hearing parents talk about some heretofore unmentioned childhood disease that almost got us before we could understand what it meant to be sick. 1840 is just close enough to home, and by that I think we all know I mean 1795, that its tarnish hurts more than the strangeness of 1897. When Lewis Edmonds, Daniel shows lucidity, our hearts are soar as profoundly as a crash when he descends into Babel. In this episode, his embrace of Barnabas and his insistence that he take the old house both save time and reign with a righteous that makes him one with the viewers. It's about effing time, and it's what we would do Two, after all, who is Daniel but the first of the first generation of kids to grow up watching Dark Shadows? That strange energy resonates through the character and right at the viewers. At last, Barnabas is not a stranger. Is Daniel crazed enough to see him as safe or sane enough to listen to his inner child whispering murmurs of danger? Who cares? Barnabas is back in business with considerably less than situational one to wade through. Early in the episode, Ben correctly notes that Barnabas isn't the same man that he was just scant moments before. The transformation from beleaguered baddie to decisive hero is a tribute naturally to Jonathan Frid and the writers, but it's also a reason to reflect on the uniqueness and relative longevity of the show. These are vastly different characters and completely understandably the same man. Just like Daniel, Barnabas has ascended twice now. If his seizure of the heroic mantle didn't grab us the first time, and the choices he makes regarding Eric Lane and Nicholas Blair, then we cannot help but cheer on now as he fully rebounds from his fall with the Leviathans and failures in Ragnarok. 1897 was not a fluke nor its fantasy roleplay. You can bet your Lindines that it was Barnabas's training ground, and it was proof to him that just as no time is truly his, all times are truly his as well. His comfort with command and decisive problem solving speaks to the best that he will be. All of who he was in 1897, with the mellowed knowledge of how rare and precious the status is. Like Fritter in Metropolis, Barnabas is a protagonist somewhere between the hands and the mind. Whenever either is the solution, he and we are quietly pleased, because we didn't know he had it in him. He's smart, but he's no Nicholas Blair, and he's strong, but few save fireplace poker bending Elliot Stokes are stronger than Adam. It's fitting that the last son of Collinwood appears in the same episode with his match Judah Zachary, a being of literally pure mind. It's a tribute to the alien intensity of actor Michael Maguire that Zachary is a character of such credible opposites. There's blazing-eyed malevolence mixed with a strange, fearful sense of being lost that I would imagine accompanies being a nearly optimate, disembodied head in a glass box. All kidding aside, after the foes Barnabas has bested, it's appropriate that he stare down not just one of the past, but all of all of all past. His enemies is the embodiment of the abstract. Defeating him will require not just Barnabas's wit and physical paralysis, but the exploration of the inhuman heart. He cannot solve Judah Zachary while being the kind of binary thinker that created Judah Zachary. Barnabas has reformed morally. 1840 will require him to go further. The first order of business is to force him to do so without Ben Stokes. You can't go home again. Home always changes. Yet it might be a place that forces you to change with it. This episode was broadcast October 7th, 1970. Okay, guys, I'm going to stop right there, and when I come back, I'm going to do episode 1124 and go forward from there a bit. I hope you guys are enjoying this. I really enjoy reading the Dark Shadows Daybook UnBound. If you have not picked this up on Kindle yet, please do so. Link will be in the description box. You guys have a great, great day.